Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk all about the translation of Bloodborne. We're going to dive right into some item descriptions, but first, as we return to the Hunter theme, I'd like to briefly recall some overarching themes relating to our Hunter. Remember how we smashed the family heirloom, the red jeweled brooch, only to gain a red blood gem for our weapons? Hunters are routinely portrayed as ruthless and utilitarian, strong of will and striving to control their emotions as well as their sanity. Just keep that in mind as we read this item description. Tearstone, silver shining tearstone, used to change into a droplet blood gem that fortifies any weapon. A doll sheds neither blood nor tears, and thus its nature remains unknown. Whoever thinks this is precious must be troubled by severe naivete. Now before anything else, let's see what happens when I use it. I get the tear blood gem. And once again, I'm smashing something of potential sentimental value for something I can put into my weapons. So now let's take a look at this new item description. Tear Blood Gem. A blood gem that fortifies weapons and adds various properties. Droplet blood gems are special gems that adapt to various weapons and shapes. Created from a shining silver doll tear, this blood gem is a quiet but unfaltering friend that continually restores HP, the life essence of a hunter. Perhaps the doll's creator had wished for just such a friend, albeit in vain. This gives us, as usual, quite a lot to talk about, but I'd like to focus in on two main points. First, in the Tearstone, there's the line that you probably noticed was missing a more literal translation. The official English version of the item description ends with the line, "Whoever thinks this is precious must be troubled by severe naivete." And yet there is no directly corresponding line for that in the Japanese. Likewise, the second point I wanted to bring up involves a similar sort of departure from the source material. In the Tear Blood Gem description, the official translation refers to it as a quiet but unfaltering friend, whereas in the original Japanese, the line in question merely likens the effect of the gem to that of a continual quiet encouragement. In both cases, though, I think that the translation stays true to what we know about hunters and emotions. In the first of these instances, what could be more like our hunter than to look past sentimental value entirely? From a certain perspective, saving this tearstone when breaking it open could give us an edge in combat would be foolish and naive. So having a line present in the translation that directly spells this out doesn't seem like it's too inappropriate. Also, there's something else to consider here. The line, "A doll sheds neither blood nor tears," is a translation of a phrase in Japanese that has its own additional idiomatic meaning. It's a saying commonly used to express the idea that someone is unfeeling or inhumane, so that particular line could also be translated, "A doll is unfeeling," or "A doll cannot possibly have emotions." By translating the phrase more literally in terms of blood and tears, something definitely appropriate to the context here in Bloodborne, there's a certain denial of emotion to the doll that isn't quite getting expressed, and I feel like the extra English line does help get across some of this idea. Alternatively, this seems like it could be a case where the Japanese line was originally there, but got removed. Either way though, let's get back to the second point about the personification of the Tear Blood Gem. What characterizing this gem as a friend does is bring out more strongly the desire for companionship the creator of the doll presumably had. It confronts us once again with sentimentality, and in this case, by association, also with mania. Recall the immense care put into the creation of the doll, and the care with which the various items of the doll set were kept. It seems clear enough that what the doll's creator wanted from the doll was likely more than quiet encouragement, and probably something more like an unfaltering friend. Basically the opposite of this guy.
Ah, you, the swindling off-comer. Did you really think that'd work? There's no fooling me. Now, off with you. You heard me. Go away. I can't stand the stench of your lying breath.
No, I insist that you tell me something.
I'll spare you one nugget of advice. Beware the blind man. There the beggar sits at the bottom of the bloody food chain, and then he's here acting like he owns the place. He's not to be trusted. What's he want with all those people anyway? That little weasel has a murky past, I'm telling you.
Yeah, I don't know if I trust your judgment.
Give it a rest, please. I've no time for your petty lies. And what? Just go away now. I can't stand the stench of your lying breath.
Now, as you can see, there are a lot of changes here that move away from a more literal translation. But at the same time, I think the official version here does a great job of conveying essentially the same meaning while staying true to the voice of the character. And probably my favorite thing about this particular set of lines is how well I think it's been written to be performed as dialogue. I'll give you an example. In the original Japanese, the end of the first portion of this guy's lines is exactly the same as the end of the last part of his lines. And you can see this in the more literal translation I've provided. Both times I have him say, "Now go on, get lost. You'll make me catch the terrible stink of a liar." And here I think the translation really shines, very much unlike how I'm throwing myself at this enemy. Because the official English not only introduces variation and provides a less clunky line, it also uses things like cut-off lines to further express the character's exasperation, which I will now elaborate on while I'm being kidnapped. So, probably the easiest place to see where the translation has been written specifically as dialogue is in the first part of this man's final line. Here he starts to say away, but cuts himself off before continuing on to say, just go away now. And of course, if we were to do a grammatical analysis of this as a proper sentence, it would be a mess. But the point here isn't to have a perfectly constructed sentence, it's to emulate speech while also conveying information about this particular character, namely that he's generally disgusted with our main character and is pretty much done interacting with us. Now, to be fair, this may actually be the result of editing done during the process of recording the dialogue. Perhaps the original translation was worded one way, but then either the original translator or a reviewer or a director or the actor decided the delivery needed to be altered to the way it appears in the game now. But whatever the process was, the final result is a line that comes across as if it were actually being spoken by a real person. And this is something that I feel adds a lot to the final product. Also, on a related note, I wanted to point out how much I appreciate the change from the more literal, "You'll make me catch the terrible stink of a liar," to "I can't stand the stench of your lying breath." It takes the concept of the character calling you a liar, the idea that your lies give you some form of foul smell, and the character's desire for you to leave as a result of these things, and reformulates them into what I feel is a much more natural line of spoken dialogue. The fact that "lyin'" and not "lying" is used here is really just icing on the cake. Anyway, my overall point is that changing lines of dialogue around to make them feel as if they were actually something a character would say can add a lot to a game. People don't always speak in complete sentences or even verbalize cohesive thoughts, and the ability to write lines that reflect that is a real skill. It's also something that, as with most of the character voices in general, I feel like the translation of Bloodborne handles well. But now let's get back to items. Messenger Urn Festival. Accessory adored by naive messengers. The messengers wear the urns, filled with incense that wards off beasts, on their heads upside down, suggesting a predilection to the dark. The inhabitants of the stump appear to have an interest in adornment. Why not let them be happy, and revel as babes? So as you can see, this is a pretty straightforward translation, but there are still a couple things I thought it'd be worth mentioning here. Both are instances where I think the official wording could potentially come across as a little confusing. First, there's the question of whether the urns on their heads are filled with incense. From the way the translation is phrased, it almost gives you the impression that they are, yet in the original Japanese, this seems much less likely. There's a phrase indicating that the jars are used for the purpose of storing beast-warding incense, and another phrase that talks about how the messengers wear these urns upside down on their heads, but just because these are jars used to store incense, that doesn't necessarily mean they're full when the messengers wear them. Of course, this doesn't rule out the possibility that the incense is in there either, and it's certainly funnier to think of them that way, so the potentially misleading wording here really isn't that much of an issue. I mainly wanted to bring it up to contrast it with the second usage of perhaps overly complex wording in this description. There's one line where my more literal translation is simply, "Perhaps messengers have a fondness for darkness," while the official translation is, "suggesting a predilection to the dark." Now, in part, I think this word choice is inspired by the rarity of the word and the kanji used to represent it in the original Japanese. Tashinamu, which in this case indicates a preference or predilection for something, isn't the kind of vocabulary that gets thrown around very often. But I also think there's a little more to it than that. I think this is a case where the description has been deliberately written to be somewhat overly elaborate for comedic effect. After all, the basic idea here is that since messengers like wearing jars on their heads, they must enjoy not being able to see somehow. Yet the way the wording works in English makes it sound as if this were a truly profound insight by effectively saying, "These beings display a marked predilection for the dark." This isn't to say that observation doesn't necessarily stand, but I do think the whole thing is being used as a form of comedy, and in this case, I think the choice to make the official English wording a little more elaborate than it needed to be, perhaps even including the decision to put the entire thought into one sentence where the original Japanese uses two, works well. So here we have 2 points where the wording of the official translation is perhaps intentionally difficult to follow in service of a bit of a joke. And though I think the first instance is perhaps a little misleading, I do enjoy the second, and the overall effect is one that I like. This actually gets at a trait that I find all of these messenger items share. They all have something of unique tone. Now, part of this comes from the final section of text that most of these items share, about letting them revel as babes. But I think it's more than just that. Pay attention to the way this next item description is worded, and I think you'll see there's something of an air of condescension about them. Messenger top hat. Hat that messengers are oddly fond of. A nice top hat rounds out any Yarnum gentleman. The inhabitants of the stump appear to have an interest in adornment. Why not let them be happy and revel as babes? So there's really only one line here that we haven't talked about in some form or another already. But even in that one line, I think you can see this condescending tone at work. The original Japanese is fairly straightforward in its description of the top hat. The line is basically just a top hat favored by Yarnum gentlemen. Yet in the official English translation, this has become a nice top hat rounds out any Yarnum gentleman. And I can't help but get a somewhat indulgent comedic tone from this, as if one of these odd-looking messengers could pass for a Yarnum gentleman. Now, to some extent, I think this is the result of another usage of the term tashinami in the Japanese, prompting some embellishment in the English. But we've also read enough messenger item descriptions by now to see that there does seem to be a marked putting down of both the messengers themselves and their beliefs. They're said to be oddly fond of some of what they wear, they're referred to as naive, and we are of course frequently encouraged to take an indulgent view of their innocent playing with these items. This is of course all mirrored in the Japanese, where they're frequently called outright mistaken on a literal translation. I find this interesting on a number of levels, both in terms of the translation, where the particular style used in various item descriptions serves several different functions, and in terms of the game itself. Remember that messengers are said to seek out, worship, and serve hunters, our own character included, and they're the only ones who understand the profundity of our badges. It raises the question of just how far we can trust their judgment. What meaning do they see in us and in these badges we bring to them? Is this value as real as that they find in the incense jars they wear on their heads? Of course, for a game that's often about finding wisdom in madness, these are good questions to be asking. And given how even the tone used in describing these items helps to make us ask these questions, I think they stand as a good example of an effective set of translations. Basically, as we saw first with the dialogue and now with the item descriptions, there's quite a lot to be accomplished by setting the right tone. Finding character voices, deciding on the overall style, and establishing this sort of thing is a big part of translation. And that brings us to the end of another episode. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for me, I'd love to hear them. Thanks for watching, everyone.